Sure,
Welcome everyone to this evening's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's fantastic to see so many attendees here today. Tonight we are going to be talking about conservation hedge laying and the effects that has on wildlife. But first I'd just like to introduce myself. My name is Sarah King. I work at Rewilding Britain as the Rewilding Network lead, and this is a Rewilding Network event, which is a community of landowners, land managers and project managers who are rewilding land and also sea. So we've been trying to build practical resources around rewilding, and the webinars that we're hosting is one of these resources that's available to network members. But tonight we wanted to make this an open event because it's such an important topic of conversation. So welcome everyone today, and if anyone has any questions about the Rewilding Network, I'd be very happy to answer them if you want to drop me a message. But as I said, tonight we're talking about conservation hedge laying and the importance that can have, especially when you're rewilding or looking at nature recovery at smaller scales. And our speaker this evening are Jonathan Thompson. Jonathan owns Underhill Wood Nature Reserve in Wiltshire. He's owned it since 2014 and it's about 25 acres. It's a small scale rewilding project. He's also the author of the Rewilding Manual, which I will send some information about at the end of this presentation and also tell you a little bit about when we get to the end as well. He's also done a webinar that some of you may have attended a couple of months ago, looking at rewilding at smaller scales at Underhill Wood Nature Reserve. And if you haven't seen that webinar, I'd encourage you to have a look at it after this. It's on our YouTube channel. I can share the link to that in the chat as well. We also have Harry James here. Harry recently graduated from Aberystwyth University with a bachelor's degree in wildlife conservation. And Harry carried out his dissertation at Underhill Wood with Jonathan, looking at the effects of conservation hedge laying on invertebrate diversity. But this presentation will also be looking at the impacts of this approach on other wildlife as well. So it's not just looking at insects. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Jonathan, who's going to tell us a little bit about Underhill Wood. Over to you, Jonathan.
Sarah, thank you very much. And as ever, Sarah, thank you for the opportunity to do these. And thank you, Rewilding Britain. And I guess for the audience, welcome. And a little loop back to what Sarah said about Rewilding Britain. I would encourage any of you who own land or doing any renaturing at any scale to join Rewilding Britain. They're a fantastic charity, amazing organization. Sarah's completely brilliant at her job. Look, she's blushing. And you get, tons of resources and advice and help and evenings like this evening where, you're a participant listening to somebody else doing something extraordinary on a rewilding project. So encourage people to join and support Rewilding Britain. Sarah's touched on some of the stuff about Underhill Wood Nature Reserve. So I'm just going to do a little bit about this. As Sarah said, we bought the land in 2014, 25 acres on the southwest Wiltshire Dorset border. It's heavy Kimmeridge clay. It had good bones. One of the reasons I bought the land was because it just had sort of the bones that I could then use to develop a small rewilding project. We had very specific aims at the beginning of the project, and indeed, sort of 8-9 years on, those aims still sustain and inform everything that we do. Something for me to say, if I'm looking down to the right-hand side, it's me looking at my notes, just so I don't miss critical things. So back to the aims. So one aim was to develop a range of habitats and increase overall levels of biodiversity on this land. And some of those interventions, we can see them in shot. There's the lake, which was dug. So that was a direct intervention. And indeed, if we come sort of to the top end of that slide, we can see the sedge marsh, which was there, but it was being, that put some drains in to drain it, and that inappropriately planted a whole range of trees in there. So we restored that by taking the trees away and then cutting out these land drains. And indeed, the rest of the work that we've done at the land has been of that nature, either small manipulations or things more significant. The second aim we had for the project was to grow Underhill Wood Nature Reserve as a place of education and engagement. And I guess we could say this evening as part of that engagement thing. And a really good example of that, and something I'm really quite proud of, is the work we do with young people and children. So I teach the John Muir Conservation Award, And indeed, on Saturday, I've got the group of kids I'm working with at the moment. And this is about teaching young people and kids about ecology and nature. And we have quite a structured program with that. And it's amazing. I get, fantastic conversion rates. Young people going off to sort of study ecology at sort of sixth form colleges and universities. So that's yeah. As I say, these two aims have sustained the length of time that I've had the land and informed pretty much everything we do. So, Sarah, next slide, please. So, talking about this, the hedges, the start, and why that becomes so important. So, a little bit of background. So, there's approximately 1.5 kilometers, 1,500 meters of hedges running across the land. Most of those hedges run on east-west axis. It was obvious when we bought the land that these hedges had not been managed for many, many years. And I've got a slide to show you, and indeed what they looked like. So they were tall, they were lanky, there were significant gaps. So for sort of 2014, 2015, there was a whole sort of debate about what do I do with these hedges. And there were sort of key turning points for me, which incrementally informed over time, indeed, what do I do with these hedges? I work closely with an extraordinarily talented, brilliant ecologist called Gareth Harris, who's a Wiltshire-based guy. And Gareth taught me and talked me through this thing called conservation hedgelaying, which we'll clearly come on to. That was a major turning point. The very early points of Harry's data, way before he was doing this write-up, where I was going sort of, what have you found, mate? Come on, what are you discovering? And just that initial sort of results from these surveys were indicating to me that this thing called conservation hedgelaying really does work. And then the third turning point was reading Ben McDonald's Rebirding, and this was a bit of a paradigm shift for me. And there's some brilliant stuff in Ben McDonald's book about the role that hedges played historically, and indeed they can play in our landscape now. And I've got a quote on the next slide from McDonald's book, but the Ben McDonald thing indicated the importance of these structures. And if they're managed in the right way, ecologically, they can have a significant benefit and outcome. So that these turning points, as I say, they came over time, and they inspired me and informed me more and more and more to do something with these hedges that was meaningful. So Sarah, next one, please. So I just selected this out of McDonald's book, and the realization from McDonald's book was it was a sort of an accident that occurred around the enclosures, where the scrub mosaic that had been the pre-enclosure, a lot of the pre-enclosure land, accidentally was then reformed in these hedges. And so things like the graniferous birds that had been a feature of pre-enclosure Britain then sustained, these species sustained because the hedges gave them what they required. And as he talks about further into the book, if you have hedges, which we do, and in fact, you can see on the right-hand picture, the hedges that we have at Underhill Wood have these big standard trees. Most of them are big veteran oaks that run through the hedges. So what have you got? You've got this sort of linear woodland. And that for me was a major turning point, as I've already alluded to. This thing, that the role that they play, and this sort of dotted line back to our history, our ecological history. And as I say, these things were contributors. So next one, Sarah. So what did these unmanaged hedges look like? One of the things that I guess I've been aware of was the lack of biodiversity and the lack of bioabundance in these hedges. And if I was just using bird species alone, it was apparent to me that these hedges supported not much. And indeed, in the winter, they supported very, very little. So they all had this sort of structure of being very tall, very lanky. Some of the hawthorn, I'll talk about a hawthorn that we laid later on, they were the best part of 10 to 15 meters. So that turned into trees. And the thing that I was curious about as I began to learn more about these hedges and read the various bits and get advice off Gareth was just the sort of the paucity of the structure at the base. So particularly in winter, the base of this it was always wet, always cold, always windy. And if we got heavy snowfall or heavy frosts, it would be completely cloaked. And it seemed to me right at the beginning that I needed to do something with this. And I spent many hours in 2014 and 15 trying to work out what that might be. I was adverse to getting agricultural machinery coming onto the land and using flailers. I didn't want all the soil compaction. The flailing itself does significant damage to the plant structure. There was one year where I did some sections sort of managing as I would in a garden, and that just didn't work. That was so labor intensive. And as I say, there was this very key turning point of Gareth, when I asked Gareth about, Gareth, what might I do with these hedges, that he talked me through and taught me this thing called conservation hedgelaying, which I've then developed by sort of, from what Gareth talked me through, I've refined it, I guess. So that's what they looked like at the beginning. And this next slide then, and indeed this is in that same run of hedge, and it's what it looks like once I've done this conservation hedgelaying. So I'm going to talk a bit now about my method, and when I do this and how I do it, and some of the key points, I guess, around conservation hedgelaying. So I do this work in winter. I tend to start sometime in December, and I'll work all the way through to sort of the back end of February. I certainly stop by the end of February, beginning of March. So if we just use sort of birds as a single, the bird species are beginning to establish territories, looking for nest sites, all that sort of spring activity is beginning to sort of occur. So I back away and don't, in fact, I stop pretty much all the work at Underhill Wood Nature Reserve at that point, but this work in particular, I stop. I only ever do sort of 40-meter sections, 40-meter runs at any one time. And there's an important point about this. The reason I do the 40 meters is bat species will use hedge lines as historical flyways. So they become key way markers for bats. So what I'm not wanting to do is to disrupt those landscape structures for bat species. Invertebrates will use them so they can fly up and down the rides of the land and get cover from predators. And it's the same thing. It's about sort of not disrupting these landscape features too much. So 40 meter, that's an arbitrary thing that I've come up with. It feels always about right to do something of that range. And then I'll talk a little bit later about how many of these runs I do across the land in its entirety over a winter. So then talking, I guess, more specifically about the method that I use and the order of work that I do. So the very first job I do is I clear enough ground at the base, and you can see in sort of the foreground of this slide. So it's about giving my access to the plant. So the very first job I do is to clear this ground. So typically this ground will be bramble, old nettles, saccharine, hawthorn, blackthorn, stuff like that. So it's good to give yourself access to the base of the plants. So I typically use a big brush cutter, or I've got a slasher, and I create this access. At the beginning, I didn't, thinking I wanted to retain all that sort of flora at the base, and it just makes the job too challenging. You're sort of, scratching yourself enough doing this. Dealing with sort of lots of overhanging bramble makes it, really, really challenging. So give myself access to the base of the plants. I don't clear, and this for me is a really important point. I don't clear any of the lateral growth on any of the plants. I leave all that lateral growth. And the important thing about that is, as I then move into the first spring and the first summer, and indeed you can see it here, if you remember what the last slide looked like, what you're creating is this immediate density. So you've got this horizontal density occurring, and it's extraordinary what these hedges look like in one single growing season. So you have this sort of depth to them and this density that just didn't exist. And most of that, or a lot of that, has been achieved by leaving these lateral branches. So you've got that sort of horizontal growth. I then start, and this is fairly standard hedge laying stuff, some of this, I then start at the point of highest elevation. So in this slide, that is to the right, underneath that big oak. So you have to lay uphill, not downhill. If you lay downhill, you kill the plant. You have to have the crown up above the base. And as we all know, sap runs uphill. So what I do at that end, at the highest end of elevation, is I cut a fairly significant gap into which I can lay the first run of plants. And I tend to cut those down to sort of 18 inches or something like that, 2 feet. And I cut this cavity out. And then that enables me then to lay those first plants over. Once you've started that process, it's then a bit of a domino effect. You work your way back down the hedgerow, laying each of these plants over, sometimes laying them onto their neighbor, and sometimes not. And I won't try to point it out, but in the middle of this picture is a plant that is supported by a big piece of oak, which has got a nice sort of V cleft. So it's not always the case that you've got a neighbor to lean the plant onto. So if you want to keep that sort of nice sort of, you know, what is it, 30-degree angle there, you have to have something that then sort of acts as a prop. In terms of cutting, and again, fairly standard hedge laying stuff, you can see bottom right, there's some fresh wood here. So I'm cutting about 18 inches off the ground. Sometimes if the plant has a significant girth, I'll use a small chainsaw. Sometimes I'll use my silky. So you're cutting through at the 45 degrees and then gently laying these plants over. I never go beyond 15 degrees. I'm very mindful of, and indeed if I'm working with volunteers, making them mindful of not going anywhere near the horizontal. So it really is a matter of keeping the crown above the base of the plant to get sort of, you know, good growth as you go into that next spring. And as I said, I do these 40-meter sections. What I'm doing at the moment, particularly inspired by Gareth, Harry, and Ben McDonald, is I've sort of upped the amount of these that I do over a winter. So last winter and the winter before, I did 4 40-meter sections. And I do that on a very loose rotation around the land. I don't have any order to that. I'll just go to somewhere that I haven't laid for a year or two, and then I'll go and lay another section. If I'm working with volunteers, and I've got a couple of people who come and do a lot of this with me, I can do it on my own comfortably. And remember, the days are short in the winter. I can do 1 40-meter section on my own. If I've got a couple of very good volunteers, as I say, who've done a fair bit of this with me, we can do 2 of these comfortably within a day. So I've got quicker at it. So I've, you know, I'm sort of practiced with this. In fact, as I was writing all this stuff, I thought one of the things I always do is I go and cut myself up a dozen pieces of hazel with, you know, good strong hazel with nice sort of V's as props. So you do all that sort of preparatory work, and I certainly wasn't doing that at the beginning. And clearing the base is something that makes it quicker. There's an interesting thing Sarah's going to just flag at the end of the talk. I'm reading a really interesting book at the moment called The Ecology of Hedgerows and Field Margins, which is a collection of academic essays by papers by a guy called, it's edited by John W. Dover. And one of the things he writes about, and that I never heard about, is a thing called wildlife hedging, which is exactly my process, except you do the laying with a digger. And I thought, man, if you had a little 3-ton digger and that was doing the laying for you, so you do all the stuff, you do the clearing of the base, the cutting of the plants, and then you lay them over with a digger, you could be doing, you know, you do on a larger piece of land many more than 1 or 2 rotations in a day. Because actually it's quite a lot of work. Laying these things over is quite hard work. You've got to get in there and do it physically, and it's challenging. So that's my method, and as I say, that's an example of a section I laid. I'm not sure when. I think I did that in the winter of 2019, perhaps. So then moving on to the first bit of hedge there. This is the first bit of hedge that I laid in 2017. And this was my first go at conservation hedge laying. And I've just written here a feature of this hedge. Really interesting thing about this hedge. It had, I don't know how tall this was, but it had a down on the right-hand side of the picture in the middle of that sort of funny little ash, there was a hawthorn that was, I don't know, 15 meters. It was completely massive, this thing. And I had a brilliant young lad who was working, sort of volunteering with me at the time, and completely ignoring health and safety. Jack climbed the hawthorn, put a bit of rope around the top. We cut it and laid it with the tractor. We pulled it down with the tractor, this great big monster. And it now sits in the base of this, and it survived and it grows, and it forms the sort of the central structure of this hedge. Just a little bit about the features of the hedge. So the dimensions, it's got this 40-meter run. It's about 4 to 6 meters deep, and it's about 4 to 5 meters in height. So a lot has happened. It had exactly the same structure at the outset as the one I showed you in that initial slide of unmanaged hedges. There's big, lanky sort of thing going on. The structure's really varied in this. That has become more important the more I've read, and then talking to Harry and reading this book I'm reading at the moment. So there's all these little microhabitats in this. There are little bays and little scallops and little protrusions out into the field margin. So there's all these wonderful little sort of, the term is heterogeneity, but there's this great diversity of structure in here. And clearly that's one of the sort of features of this hedgerow management. The plants in this, predominantly things like bramble, hawthorn, hazel, blackthorn. There's a little bit of ash in there that's got a little bit of dieback, and field maple. So a really nice mix of standard hedgerow plants. One of the things that I started reading about, in fact, when Gareth had taught me through conservation hedgelaying, he gave me a couple of papers to read, was the importance of the margin. So, if you think about a lot of the flailed hedges we see, even if the hedge itself is sort of managed okay, what typically happens is the margins are not. So there's no sort of feathering margin, and are sort of cut right up to the base of the hedge. One of the things I'm very mindful of is having this feathering that runs from the base of the hedge out through this sort of rough grassland and then out into the right in the field. And so you create this nice sort of pyramidal triangular shape. And that's something I'm really sort of mindful of ensuring that there's this. In fact, this year, I'm going to move this right out. One of the things that in one of Dover's papers, he talks about is having these margins 6 meters wide. And I don't have, some of them I probably get close, this one I don't. So I'm going to move this right out. And clearly, if you think about invertebrates basking and sort of, graniferous birds having access to sort of lovely grass seed, there's all sorts of things going on in this margin that complement the hedge. For me, the first indicator that this was transformative, way before, in fact, probably Harry, before you went to university perhaps, was in the winter of 2018, 2019, and indeed this has been repeated in subsequent winters. Was a really big flock of mixed fieldfares, redwings, and wintering blackbirds. And they were using and inhabiting all the conservation hedge-laid hedges at the land. And previously, there had been those species. They would come through in the winter and they would plunder the holly and eat some of the bramble, but they would move on. They weren't there all winter. In that winter, they were at the land all winter, and they have been subsequently. And this hedge in particular at night was just this complete mad cacophony of birds roosting and singing themselves into their sort of silence. And it was interesting watching them. They were eating slow old brambleberries, hips, stuff like that. And it was apparent to me, just by using those three bird species, that this has got significant potential. And indeed, that story with Harry's work has been advanced. So that's me. I'm done. Sarah, you've already introduced Harry, but I'm just going to big him up a bit more before he starts, right? So this guy is amazing, Harry James. There he is. He's down there in the sort of third box. Harry first came to Underhill Nature Reserve as probably 14, 15-year-old. In fact, he came when a lovely guy called Richard Kerridge, who's a really good hepatologist who wrote a book called In Cold Blood, did a snake event. And that was the first time I met Harry. And Harry, in his school holidays, volunteered with me for many, many years. And in fact, Harry, I remember the first thing we ever did was we made an eco-mimicking beaver dam in the stream, and it's still there and it still works. And so Harry's been a feature. He's been sort of heart and soul of the project, since he was a 14, 15-year-old. And as Sarah talked about, he went off to Aberystwyth University, did his fantastic BSc, and he did his dissertation on Underhill Wood, and he got a first. Come on. So I'm done. Over to you, Harry.
All right. Cheers for bigging me up, Jonathan. And as Jonathan was saying earlier, a big thanks to Sarah King and Rewilding Britain for letting me come and talk about this. Because when I was doing my dissertation, one of the big things that just kept coming into my head almost every day that I was working on it was thinking more people need to hear about this. Because from living down here in the countryside, you see hedgerows every day, and you kind of just assume that they are what they are and they don't need managing. but in fact it's the polar opposite of that. So I'm going to be talking to you a bit more about conservation hedge laying in a bit more detail, focusing mainly on the theory behind hedgerows and the results of putting conservation hedge laying into practice. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the nitty-gritty stuff, a bit of history behind hedgerows, because with all things historical, you need to understand the past to understand the present. So hedgerows have been a primary feature across our agricultural landscape throughout history as natural enclosures for livestock and arable land. This all started to get somewhat controlled by legislation as of the 1600s, thanks to the Enclosure Act. However, in parallel with agricultural uses, hedgerows have incredible ecological uses as corridors, allowing both flora and fauna to move between habitats. You end up with these connections between habitats. However, since 1984, we've seen almost 25% decrease in hedgerows across the UK. And this is mostly thought to be because of changes in agricultural practices. Okay, next one, please, Sarah. So traditionally, hedgerows were managed in a very similar way to conservation hedge laying, where you would remove about a third of the vegetation within the hedgerows structure, lay them uphill, and as Jonathan was saying that he does at Underhill, you sometimes use bits of hazel or other stems as support. This form of hedge laying was incredibly beneficial, not only for its structural integrity for containing livestock, but was also widely recognized to improve the rate of flower and fruit production. However, with the introduction of mechanization to agricultural practices, hedgerows have unfortunately succumbed to polar ends of the management spectrum, both overmanagement and neglect. The most common form of overmanagement of hedgerows here in the UK is flailing, which is used primarily to increase sunlight on arable land. But as I'm sure you've seen from driving around the countryside, it also creates this idea of uniformity. And whilst it looks nice as you drive past it, it greatly reduces the internal density of the hedgerow. So whilst it looks okay from the outside, you still get all the green growth in the spring. What's going on inside is, in fact, a very degraded habitat. The other end of the spectrum is neglect. So 48% of British hedgerows, of that 500,000 kilometres that I mentioned earlier, are recognised to be in a state of neglect, mostly down to the fact that hedgerows are less necessary in many modern agricultural practices. Because of this neglect, they are overwhelmed by habitat succession, and these hedgerows are transformed into long stands of trees. Now, whilst this doesn't seem like a bad thing ecologically, it greatly reduces the ecological connectivity of these hedgerows, as the only place that a lot of animals and plants can move between is the canopy, whereas the whole idea with a hedgerow is that you have this dense internal structure that they can move through safely. Next one, please. So the second focus of my side of this talk is invertebrates, as it was the main focus of my dissertation. So to date, we have formally identified around 1 million species of invertebrates. However, it's widely believed that there are roughly 30 million species worldwide, making up 90% of the world's faunal species. Now, they fulfill a number of valuable niches and ecosystem services, including soil regulation, nutrient control and cycling, pollination, and the base of trophic structures within ecosystems. Despite this, there is an undeniable lack of conservation efforts regarding invertebrates. This is mainly due to a lack of interest and understanding of the species on an individual level. So if we are struggling to understand them on an individual level, we need to broaden our approach and start having a look at an ecosystem as a whole, or a habitat. So with that in mind, let's consider hedgerows. Next one, please, Sarah. So from the project that I conducted at Underhill, I aim to achieve answers on 3 main questions. The first one being, does conservation hedgelaying increase the species richness of invertebrates within the hedgerow? Does it increase the invertebrate density, so the number of individuals within the hedgerow? And finally, is the theory behind conservation hedgelaying factually correct in assuming that foliage density increases? Next one, please, Sarah. So the study itself consisted of me cutting channels into the base of the hedgerows with a strimmer, leaving it to acclimate because the bugs don't like the vibrations of a strimmer, believe it or not. I then went back, pushed in a 1 by 1 meter drop tray that you can see on the left, smacked the hedge, very scientific, took it out and photographed what had fallen. Next, please, Sarah. It should bring up a picture of a map of Underhill. There we go. In total, I took 45 samples across the site from 15 individual hedgerow sites, and collected 15 samples for each hedgerow age category. Now, this was unmanaged hedgerows, hedgerows that were managed 1 to 2 years prior, and hedgerows that were managed 3 to 4 years prior. So you end up with control, young, and mature. Okay. Then, in order to investigate the foliage density aspect of my project, I used this 1 by 1 meter checkerboard that you can see on the left, in order to estimate as a percentage the foliage density. So I would put it on one side of the hedgerow, run round and look at it from the other side and count how many squares I could distinctly see. Whilst this does seem really rudimentary, the kit required to do this on a proper scientific level is astronomically expensive. And this, in fact, yields very, very similar results. So if you ever want to measure the foliage density of your hedge, don't spend £2 grand, just buy some spray paint. Next one, please, Sarah. So looking at the data that I collected, and I will just say before I go into this properly, I'm going to completely brush over a lot of the detail from this data and just focus on the main points. If you are wanting to have a look at this data in more detail, there's an email at the end of this presentation which you can send an email over to me and I can send you my dissertation to see the other aspects of this data, because this is a huge oversimplification of all the data that I collected. But starting with the species richness, the data showed a significant increase in the number of individual invertebrate species as the hedgerows matured, with a 20% increase in the first 2 years and a 40% increase within the first 4 years. Now, Jonathan and I were thinking about this. If you scale this up, assuming that it increases at the same rate every 2 years, you're looking at a 100% increase, so a double in the current numbers of unmanaged hedgerows after 10 years, which, funnily enough, corresponds with quite a few other things with hedgerows in terms of conservation hedgelaying when you should remanage them, but that's another thing we could talk about. Looking at species richness, a team in 2007 attempted to identify the primary features that affect species richness within a habitat and managed to boil them down to 3 individual categories. So we've got geographic, biotic, and environmental. The geographic features include the total number of species that a habitat can support, the total range that those species can disperse outside of that habitat, and the ease of which they can disperse. Then you have the biotic features, which include the amount of competition for resources, the relationships between species, and the rates of predation within a habitat. Then you have the environmental features, which include exposure to weather conditions, the amount of exposure, and the complexity of the habitat, otherwise known as heterogeneity, as Jonathan said earlier. Next one, please, Sarah. Now, these factors tie in massively to conservation hedge laying, as firstly, connectivity, which is associated with hedgerows, improves the dispersal distance and the ease of dispersal for individuals, as it links up habitats and gives them a safe space to travel to avoid exposure and predation from the sky. You also end up, due to the larger and denser habitat through conservation hedge laying as opposed to a flailed hedge, end up with a reduction in competition for resources, as there's a higher abundance of resources, as well as a reduction in the exposure to adverse weather conditions, because in a more dense hedgerow like this one in front of you, the internal structure is completely separated from any external pressures, such as heavy winds, heavy rain. At the moment, with heavy heat, to avoid heat, they can go down into the internal structure of the hedge, where it will be significantly cooler than on the outside. And finally, due to the, as I was just mentioning, different habitat features within a conservation laid hedgerow, you end up with a higher level of habitat complexity, rather than just the fringes in a flailed hedgerow and the open interior of a hedgerow. Next one, please, Sarah. So the data also showed that there was a significant increase in the number of invertebrates in total present within the hedgerows, with again a 20% increase within the first 2 years, and funnily enough, again a 40% increase within the first 4 years. The reasons for this are essentially the same as species richness. However, one characteristic that I forgot, well, it wasn't I forgot, I didn't have enough time to include within my dissertation, was the idea of habitat volume. As Jonathan mentioned earlier, a conservation laid hedgerow is taller, wider than an unmanaged hedgerow. So with that in mind, you have essentially more habitat to work with. So it would have been interesting to incorporate that, but I didn't manage to. Next one, please, Sarah. So the final point about my data was the foliage density, which again showed a significant increase as the hedgerows matured, and therefore a greater number of opportunities for wildlife within the habitat. The increase was so significant, in fact, that in the 3 to 4 year old hedgerows, as I'll show you in a second, the checkerboard was completely obscured. You could not see a single bit of orange through the hedgerow, which thankfully agrees with the theory behind conservation hedge laying, and that it should in fact increase the internal foliage density. Next one, please, Sarah. So as I was saying, this was an unmanaged stretch of hedgerow. So Jonathan and I hadn't done anything to this. I put the checkerboard over the other side, and whilst it's not completely distinguishable, you can see the individual squares. And I think this one in particular ended up being high teens, low 20s in terms of percentage that you could see through the hedgerow. However, if you move on to the next one, Sarah, this was a 4 year old hedgerow, and I promise you there is a checkerboard round the other side of this and you cannot see a thing. So I think this picture in particular completely shows the effect that conservation hedge laying has on the internal density of these hedgerows, and therefore the effects that that has on the ecosystem within it. Next one, please. Okay, so if you're not so fussed about invertebrates, then I don't blame you. I'm a bit of a bug nut. So this next part is a broader look at the benefits of conservation hedge laying on local ecology. So the idea of conservation hedge laying, whilst I focused on invertebrates, is hugely important in terms of the knock-on effects. So whilst I collected lots of data on invertebrates, you will have the idea of a trophic cascade, where you will get things that feed on the invertebrates, things that feed on the invertebrates, and so on. So firstly, an increase in insects and fruiting shrubs will subsequently cause a greater availability for food for many birds, small mammals, and reptiles. On top of that, a greater foliage density will also create more breeding and nesting opportunities for birds. that book that Jonathan was mentioning that is at the end of this presentation, which you should definitely go and read. I've got it on my list. He was talking to me about, it mentioned a decrease in the rate of nest predation from corvids. So not only does it affect the nesting opportunities and breeding opportunities, but also makes those opportunities a safe environment. Sorry, yeah, go on, Jonathan.
No, it's a really interesting statistic. So a hedge, which is conservation hedge laying, or in the book it talks about wildlife hedge laying, reduces corvid predation by 84%, and that's predation on eggs, sort of sacking of nests, and predation of nestlings. So there's this whole thing where people are using larsen traps to catch magpies. If they conservation hedge laid and there was the proper habitat for nesting small field birds, it's about habitat removal. And it was a really striking statistic for me. And you can see why. There's no way that a corvid is going to get penetration into that deep hedge. It's not going to happen.
Perfect. Next one, please, Sarah. So next is the idea of pollination. It's another huge knock-on effect from the aspects that I did my dissertation on. As bees are shown to greatly improve the crop yield of arable crops, as well as reducing the crop's vulnerability to diseases by increasing the genetic diversity within the crops. Whilst they're not always seen as pollinators, butterflies play a huge role in pollination services. And with 64% of our British species known to utilize hedgerow habitats, hedgerow management could be crucial in conserving some of our suffering species in terms of butterflies. Next one, please. And now looking at everything from a broad perspective instead of from a species perspective, hedgerows also have a knock-on effect with surrounding habitats. So with this idea of connectivity, it doesn't just affect animals like your dormice, your birds, it also affects plants by encouraging seed dispersal. So with the idea of seed dispersal, you're greatly diversifying the floral makeup within a certain habitat. But on top of that, same with the crops, you're increasing the amount of genetic diversity within these floral species, making them less resistant to disease. And with increasing temperatures, diseases will rise, and anything that hasn't developed a resistance is going to suffer. So with an idea of developing this resistance, you're less likely to see habitats in general suffer from these climatic changes. And finally, this dispersal of plants plays a really crucial role in the secondary successive growth within habitats. So that's your species like bracken, bramble, nettle, in some cases hazel, anything that comes from the initial habitat. And in situations like Underhill with Jonathan, secondary successive growth has played an immense role in restoring a habitat from its human affected state. So with that in mind, not only are hedgerows going to affect habitats, animals, plants, but in terms of rewilding as a whole, as a practice, hedgerows could be really beneficial in not only helping the process, but also speeding it up by encouraging the secondary growth. Next, please, Sarah. So to summarize, Jonathan and I have completely thrown a load of information at you today. But the main takeaways from this presentation should be that hedgerows support a huge number of both floral and faunal species. But Britain as a whole, the quality of these hedgerows is in a huge decline. However, we can prevent this with proper hedgerow management. Conservation hedge laying is a cost-effective and simple way of bettering our hedgerow management, and with a hugely beneficial outcome ecologically. If my data shows anything, it shows that the effects of conservation hedge laying on hedgerow structure and invertebrate assemblages are incredibly significant. But then considering the knock-on effects of those two topics on Britain's wider ecology, we need to start considering hedgerows as a method of widespread conservation within Britain. So if you can take anything away from today, if you have a 2-meter stretch of hedgerow in your back garden, or you have a 40-kilometer stretch on a plot of land, give conservation hedgelaying a try. Because as Jonathan said earlier, you don't have to go out there with a chainsaw and push it all over by hand or drag it over with a rope. If you are doing it on a large scale, and doing a bit of manual labor is going to slow things down or whatever, try using a boom on a digger or whatever. It's a hugely diverse practice, but the main points of it can always be the same, which is don't cut everything down, lay it over, let it grow. Okay. So yeah, conservation hedge lay.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Thanks, Harry. So just to finish off, in terms of a call for action, at Rewilding Britain, we're calling for 30% of our land to be in rewilding and nature recovery by 2030, in line with the government policy. So just based on this presentation and the inspiration and the evidence that we've seen from Underhill Wood Nature Reserve, can you imagine if at least 30% of our 500,000 kilometres of hedges in the UK were managed like this? Can you imagine the wildlife abundance and the nature recovery that we would see? And we know at the moment that nature is in decline. So that kind of nature recovery would be significant for our ecosystems, for our pollinators, and all the services and the carbon storage that we have associated with that. So I think this is a fantastic example of how this can be accessible to everyone. It might not be larger scale rewilding projects. You might only have a smaller scale rewilding project or a garden or a local park. This approach can really restore wildlife to those areas and almost press the reset button on some of those hedgerows that just need a little bit of help to allow those natural processes and that wildlife to return. So let's just imagine what difference we could make if we implemented this change across all of our hedgerows. If you want to find out more, Jonathan's mentioned this a few times, but there is a book called The Ecology of Hedgerows and Field Margins. My colleague Millie has put that in the chat if you want a link to that. It's a fantastic book if you want to learn more about the ecology of and management of hedgerows. But I'd also just like to say that if you haven't seen it already, please do check out Jonathan's manual on how to rewild. It's a fantastic practical manual about Underhill Wood Nature Reserve. The link is on here. I can share it after the webinar as well. But also do go on our YouTube channel and watch the webinar that Jonathan did a few months ago on Underhill Wood Nature Reserve if you haven't seen that already, because that will give you a fantastic introduction in rewilding at smaller scales. And now we're going to go to questions, but before we do, there's contact information on here if you want to contact Harry for more information or for some of that data. Also, if you aren't a part of the Rewilding Network already and you do have a project on the ground that you are rewilding or looking to start rewilding, please do think about joining the Rewilding Network. It's completely free and it's a community of rewilders facilitating knowledge exchange and building up our practical resources. So do check that out as well. But Harry and Jonathan, if you want to just unmute, I will start going through some of the questions, if that's okay. So firstly, linked to one of the first questions in the chat, but one that I had written down as well. If someone was interested in trying this, are there any videos available, or are there any specific training courses or particular manuals, I guess, on how to do it if someone was interested in getting started and wasn't quite sure how to implement it?
So I guess that's a question for me. I write a reasonable description in the manual about conservation hedge laying. There's a decent chance that the manual is going to be published in the next wee while. And as part of that publishing, I've just gone through and done a bit of a due diligence on the manual. And I'm going to write more about conservation hedge laying and give it a more fulsome description and putting some of Harry's data points in the manual, because it's clearly become so important. So there's that thought. The second thought is I run 3 to 4 rewilding workshops. They're one-day workshops at Underhill Wood every spring, and a significant part of that workshop is the conservation hedge laying. If somebody wants to offer to come along and film, and film and volunteer, that would be good. And I do a decent lunch. So if somebody wanted to come and in fact film a day of us doing conservation hedge laying that we could then put on the YouTube channel. Underhill Wood Nature Reserve has a very modest YouTube channel. That would be something I would contemplate. But no, as I say, Gareth Harris, this very brilliant ecologist, many years ago, sort of taught me and talked me through this. And it's just something I've sort of refined and made up a bit, sort of just, as I say, refined over the years. But those two things, and indeed, if somebody's a good film person, come and film it.
Fantastic, thank you. Lorraine has asked a question. When you're talking about laying upwards, does this involve planting new plants? Is it dead laying, or are you keeping the plants alive when you do that work?
So planting, no, it's not planting. It's dealing with the existing vegetation. Planting, even at the scale of land that we have, is really problematic. You get a summer like this, and you're just dealing with a complete nightmare if you plant. We planted an orchard. In fact, Harry, you and I planted that orchard in the winter of 2018, and trying to keep that thing alive at the moment is a bit of a nightmare. So no, this is not about planting. It's dealing with your existing vegetation in your unmanaged hedge lines. So no, you're not killing the plants. You get really practiced when you do your 45-degree cut at the base of each plant of testing when they're ready to be laid. And you do that. I do that really quite gently. So what I don't want to do is sever the last bit of that bark. You don't need much. It's extraordinary how thin that can be. It doesn't need to be any more than, say, 2 or 3 inches in width. But as long as you retain a bit of that dermis, a bit of the bark, and a bit of that internal sort of the dermis that sits under the bark, as long as you retain that, the plant will live. I guess I've never looked at it. There's so much density when you get into that first spring. It's likely to be the case that some of these plants will die. But it seems to me they tend not to.
And I guess try it in a small section as well and see how it goes.
Yeah, I the first ones I laid, I've got better and better and better, and I'm quicker and more efficient, and they work more.
Perfect. And we've got another question about does a hedgerow in the shade of mature trees still have ecological benefit? Do you see any difference of the sections of hedgerow that have those mature trees shade when you do this approach compared to some of the sunnier areas?
Harry, you might have I'll talk about the non-scientific elements of this, and Harry, you might have a view on that in terms of invertebrate species and
Sure.
fruiting plants. So because we've got these big huge oaks which run through these hedge lines. So some areas are shaded. It seems to me you get that sort of base density. You don't, clearly, because they're in the shade, you're not getting as much growth. So the one that I did in 2017, that's out in the open, and it's the growth has been rampant. There are other areas which are shaded from the south because they're running east-west. Some of them have trees to the south of these hedgerows, and no, you don't get as much growth, but you change the structure, irrespective of whether it's in the shade or not. You're creating that, as Harry's talked about, the density at the base, and you're changing that structure. So that's what I notice. Harry, would you have an answer in terms of potential flora and fauna?
I would say that if it's a tree that's not in the line of the hedgerow, then I would say it wouldn't cause many issues at all. You're adding another level of complexity to an already complex ecosystem by adding a shaded area with a canopy over the top. However, if it's in the line of the hedgerow and you have a big trunk blocking that line, you're going to lose out on some of that connectivity, because unless it's a species that is happily going to climb around a tree trunk, you're going to lose. It'll end up being a barrier on something that you probably would have already tried to make overly connective. But in terms of shade, if it's one section of the hedgerow and not the entire thing, then I don't think that's a bad thing at all.
It's an interesting point, Harry, about the standard trees, because what I find over time is actually the hedge wraps itself around the base.
Yeah.
And because I retain these big sort of wide margins, it ends up sort of as this wonderful sort of necklace around the base of the oak, of these big oaks. So I guess it probably reduces dispersal, but I don't think it completely stops it. I don't.
No. I would say it would act as a barrier sort of thing, because especially if you're in a more confined circumstance, if you need to keep a hedgerow at a certain width and you can't afford for it to develop that necklace, then it could end up being an issue. But anyway.
So next question, how often do you need to do conservation hedge laying? Is it something that you have to do regularly, or once you've done it, do you then kind of leave the hedge to it? And also, is it something you can do on all types of hedges, for example, those on earth and stone banks?
So let me start at the end and work backwards. So earth and stone banks, I don't know. I don't have earth and stone banks, as one of the points I make in the rewilding manual. The manual, and I guess my knowledge is based on sort of endless reading, but also based on my practice at Underhill Wood Nature Reserve. So we have bunds on the land. So most of these hedges are laid on bunds. If I think about sort of, the standards stone structure that you get in places like Cornwall, I don't know. I don't have an answer to that. I guess it would be as effective, I'm assuming, but I don't know. And I don't know what effect it would have on the sort of architectural structure of those more traditional sort of bunds that you get. In terms of, sorry, what was the first part of the question?
Do you have to do it again? How often do you have to do it? Is it an ongoing management?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Harry and I had a conversation about this a few months ago about imagining when do I do it next. And based on Harry's data, given the fact that if those trends of species, biodiversity and bioabundance increased at the levels that they seem to be increasing at, you would get at sort of maximum species and maximum sort of richness and biodiversity and bioabundance in a decade. Having read most of this book on ecology, hedgerows and field management, what he talks about is traditionally when people were doing hedgerow management manually, sort of post-enclosure, sort of late 1800s, the rotation they worked to was 10 to 40 years. So it's interesting, the 10 years that Harry and I imagined is at the bottom end of that rotation. So yes, you do need to do something in time, but it's a very long rotation. So it's interesting that 40 years, like, man, I'm not going to be here in 40 years. Harry, you'll be doing it.
You won't have to do it again.
I can't imagine what they would look like in 40 years' time. They'd be vast. Yeah. But it's within that time frame, and it's interesting that Harry and I thought 10 years. So we went, we were in those parameters. Yeah.
Perfect. I'm conscious of time, but I think we can fit one more question in. Can you use a similar technique on the edge of a woodland, or does the hedge need to be freestanding?
One of those, in fact, in one of Harry's photographs, one of Harry's slides, the hedge is on the edge of a woodland. So I've used this technique. Underhill Wood on the most sort of southwestern corner has a 6-acre plantation woodland that we inherited. And the hedge that runs along the east-west, it runs to the north on an east-west axis to that woodland. It is right up against a woodland. And it's exactly this. I've used exactly the same method. And from florally, the sort of floral species and the structural sort of integrity of the hedge, it's done exactly the same thing. And it fits with Harry's point about the fact that the trees are, what are they? They're probably 6 meters away from the hedge. There's a decent ride between the edge of the woodland and that hedgerow. And they've achieved exactly the same changes. So yes, right. I think those tall, lanky hedges, it's Harry's point right at the beginning of his bit about unmanaged hedges, neglected hedges, then they're doing not much.
Perfect. There's a couple of questions in the chat about initiatives to try and get this message across to farmers and what could happen in the future in terms of hedgerow management. We don't have time to go into that today, but I think with the emerging ELM scheme in England and the change in agricultural policy should really push forward, I think, a change in management across a lot of our countryside. So I think I'm hopeful that this kind of approach could be taken to improve our hedgerows going forward. So I think that's all we've got time for. So I just want to say thank you so much to Jonathan and Harry. It's been an enlightening webinar. I hope everyone's enjoyed it as much as I have. And I think it's been fantastic to see the impact that this management technique can have on hedgerows. So yeah, if anyone on here have got hedgerows that are looking similarly neglected, do give it a go, try it out, have a look at the links that we're going to send through with the recording afterwards, and hopefully that will result in an abundance and the return of nature. So thank you ever so much for coming and giving us your time today. And yeah, I hope everyone has a very pleasant evening.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you so much. Brilliant.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Good stuff.